Thank you to Robin Kappan and family for dedicating this sermon in memory of Dr. Mitchell Kappan. I enrolled in culinary school when I was in my last semester of college. I had a few courses left to finish of my undergrad, and I had time on my hands, and it was something I'd been thinking about for a long time. And it was only my final year of college when I realized that there was actually a way to make it part of my career plans. I wanted to work in public health, and I wanted to help people learn how to make nutritious, healthy food on the budgets that they had and with the foods that were accessible to them. So I went to the Natural Gourmet Institute, which was a culinary school dedicated to thinking about how food interacts with our bodies, how different ways of thinking about food might impact the way we choose to eat. But before we learned how to cook anything, we learned about knives. The school was rooted in both French and Japanese culinary techniques, so we received 2 large chef's knives of different shapes, and they were really scary looking. And we learned how to sharpen them, we learned how to store them, how to clean them, how to chop quickly by curling our fingers without hurting ourselves, which actually took quite a bit of practice, and I may or may not have had an incident on the very first day with my new knife. But the rule that ingrained itself in me the most significantly, and which stresses me out when it's violated in somebody else's kitchen or if someone else is in my kitchen, is an elemental rule that actually is pretty simple when you think about it. Never ever leave your knife in the sink. If you have a dirty knife, you take it to the sink, you wash it, you dry it, and you put it away appropriately. Makes sense. If a knife is at the bottom of the sink, it might get covered in dirty pots and pans, it might get filled with soapy water, and then somebody sticks their hand in not knowing there's a knife there. You might even do it yourself, forgetting that you had left your knife there, and they cut themselves. This rule might seem banal, but being aware of how our actions can impact others, how we can protect others from our own carelessness, is tremendously holy work. Probably my classmates didn't really think about it in those lines, but by not leaving my knife in the sink, I'm telling the other people I'm sharing a kitchen with, that I'm cooking with, that I care about their hands, that I care about their safety. After the drama of the Exodus from Egypt, the second half of the book of Shemot is concerned with these types of mundane activities and makes these holy, essential behaviors that we cannot afford to ignore. We read Mishpatim on the heels of the palpable holiness of the revelation at Sinai. No question there that the laws given are tremendously holy and special. But in contrast, this parsha is full of rules about daily human interactions that might make us question, are these godly? Are they sacred? But the continuation from their divine encounter these laws were unlike the laws that they had in Egypt. They weren't designed to oppress the people, but actually the fact that they come right after Sinai pushes us to see them differently. Unlike the laws that held them captive, those laws had no greater purpose than enslavement. The laws of the Torah are religious obligations that are part of our ongoing relationship with God, even when they are prescribing behavior between people. The parsha opens with God saying to Moses, "Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem," and these are the laws you will place before the people. The letter Vav, the and, that starts the parsha reminds us that these are not ordinary civil laws. This single letter, representing a conjunction that is so often overlooked, signals to us that these are sacred laws connected to and just as remarkable as the commandments we received last week in Parshat Yitro. These laws are also part of God's revelation that began with the people trembling at the foot of Mount Sinai, where the Israelites transitioned from slaves to people who were in powerful and intimate relationships with the divine. Though the laws that start this week's Parsha, Mishpatim, seem like rules about how to interact with one another, they're also laws about how to bring holiness into those interactions, and how that holiness can lift us up in order to keep us in that close relationship with God we experienced at Sinai. Mishpatim opens by explicitly connecting the laws that follow with what came before. And one of those laws, actually several of them, falls into the no knives in the sink category. It has practical implications, but also hints at the significance of noticing things beyond ourselves. V'chi yiftaf ish bor, o ki yichre ish bor velo yichasenu v'nafal shama, shor o chamor, bal habor yishalem kesef. If or when a person opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one responsible for the pit has to make restitution. They have to pay the owner of the animal that fell into the pit. On the surface, this seems like a very straightforward, simple ruling. If you make a hole in the ground and an animal gets injured, you're responsible for compensating the animal's owner. But if we dig a little deeper, pun intended, we learn more about the values underlying it. First, you should care if someone else's animal, someone else's property, or someone else gets hurt because of your negligence. And second, we should be paying attention and taking responsibility for our actions. If you dig a pit, cover it. Even if you are digging a pit on your own private property and you are the only living thing inhabiting that property, take the time to make it safe for others. Carelessness and a lack of awareness makes it difficult, if not impossible, to live in community. Even though this law is directed at a singular person, ultimately, its goal is to ensure that the environment is livable. It is clear that this is only possible if everyone operates with an awareness for how their lives impact their surroundings. There's a midrash in Vayikra Rabbah that actually is a story that shows up in all kinds of different religious and philosophical traditions that reinforces this message. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught a story about a group of people on a ship, and one took a drill and started boring in the wood underneath his seat. The other said, "What are you doing?" And he answered, "Why do you care? I'm only drilling under my seat." They replied, "But the water will come up that hole and flood the ship, and we will all drown." If we live our lives thinking only about our own seat, drilling holes or uncovering pits only concerned about our own needs, and not noticing or paying attention to the ramifications for those around us, we will inevitably sink the ship, like in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's story. But if we live with our heads up and looking around us, our ships will continue to float, and our lives will be elevated through our heightened awareness and curiosity. This notion of living with a concern for the people around us and seeking out their well-being is also emphasized in an interpretation of our verse in Mishpatim by the Hasidic teacher Noam Elimelech. He translates the verse, "when a righteous person opens a pit." This interpretation is significant because it's not conditional. He does not translate ki as if a person, but rather he assumes a pit will be open, that we will all open pits in our lives. We will all be responsible for doing things that present possible danger to others. But Elimelech's pit is opened by a righteous person, a person who knows how to properly dig holes. In this case, the holes represent the holiness that can be found in other people's hearts. The metaphor continues with the inclusion of digging in the verse, since discovering that awe in others is not easy, and it can take real excavation to uncover it. So when the Torah says that if a person opens or digs a pit, Elimelech understands this to mean that walking through the world as a righteous person means constantly trying to find the holiness in others, even when it is difficult or does not seem overtly present. Much like the more literal interpretation of the verse, this Hasidic teaching helps us more firmly grasp how we can encounter others in order to build sacred communities together. When we notice the world around us, we take more care to cover the potential dangers we leave behind. We dig cautiously to find the holiness in someone's heart. In Parshat Yitro, the people were taught to look upwards toward the heavens for holiness. They were shaken by lightning and thunder and the overwhelming presence of divinity and learned to pay attention to God. But Mishpatim turns us in a different direction. This injunction about covering up the pits we unearth teaches us that we also have to look down and around. We have to notice the implications of how we exist in the world, and we have to notice the people we share the space with and find holiness in them. By connecting it to the laws that God gave during the revelation at Mount Sinai, we learn that these rules are part of our religious obligation to God and each other. Parshat Mishpatim teaches us that there is spiritual significance in cultivating a habit of noticing. This rule is a reminder and a charge to each of us that we need to be people on alert. We need to be keeping an eye out and trying to anticipate the pits in the ground that might cause others to trip, and we need to constantly identify and implement correctives to the obstacles that do exist. We need to wash and properly store our knives after we use them, rather than leaving them at the bottom of a soapy sink full of dishes. The Torah is not banning pit digging or telling us to stop living our lives the way we want to. The Torah understands that we might need pits, that there might be good reasons for the existence of the obstacles we encounter or create. But Mishpatim asks us to cultivate an awareness of and a posture of generosity towards others so that we can continue to live in holy society bound by our connectedness to each other and to God.